You are indeed watching Breakthrough News, and this is the Freedom Side Live. I'm Eugene Puryear, and welcome back to everyone who joins us every Thursday at 8 p.m. Eastern on the Freedom Side, and welcome for the first time anyone who is just joining us here tonight. We've got a fantastic lineup of topics, of people, of individuals. We're going to be digging deeper into Minneapolis, in particular because this week, as people may have seen, the officer who murdered George Floyd last May, Derek Chauvin, his trial, or jury selection in his trial, began this week in Minneapolis. Opening arguments will begin on March 29th. He is charged with second and third-degree murder in that case. So we will be talking about many of the implications around that specific case of Derek Chauvin, the murder of George Floyd. We're also going to be talking about what justice for George Floyd could and should look like. We're going to look deeper into the history of police terror in Minneapolis, and we're very honored to be able to speak with three families of victims of police terror in the broader Minneapolis region. So we'll talk more about that sordid history. And we're also going to be joined by Dr. Gerald Horne later in the show to help us put all of this in context. So as you can see, an important show, an action-packed show in many ways. So we always ask at the beginning of the show that before we start, just take a second, hit that share button, so whoever is following you can follow us and see the great program we have lined up for you here tonight. So please just take a quick second and share this stream wherever you're watching with everyone who is following you. Now, as we start off the show here, want to go to the booth, to my man Juan. Juan in the booth, as it were. Juan, how you feeling this evening?
Hey, Eugene. Yeah, I'm feeling good. How about you? How you doing?
I'm as good as can be expected. There's obviously a lot of things going on, but happy to be here on the Freedom Side Live.
Yeah, always happy to be here. Eugene, I don't know if you saw this. Well, actually, I do know you saw this. But the interview with Meghan Markle and Oprah.
Of course.
How do you feel
Shocking
about this?
the world. I have a lot of feelings, Juan. I mean, on the one hand, the whole thing seems a little ridiculous. I mean, you just got sort of two sides of very rich people arguing over who's meaner, who's nicer, while they all have hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars. I mean, on the other hand, obviously, it's a look into, I think, what's the best way to say this? How antiquated the British monarchy really is in the 21st century and why exactly they're spending billions of dollars on these people, but refuse to give a pay raise, for instance, to nurses in the NHS. So that's also happening. Also, the reopening of the War of 1812 that seems to happen through this. I mean, that is interesting, just the cultural power of this. Why is the President of the United States making a statement about this? I have no idea. Hillary Clinton's making statements. You've got half the actors in Hollywood's making statements. So it's like America versus the Queen. So there's a lot of different pieces to it. I will say there's been some amazing comedy that has come out, especially on social media, in relationship to this. So it's been interesting to watch. I'll say that one.
Yeah, it's so true. I mean, that's one thing I love is definitely like the pop culture and the way that, people really react to all this kind of stuff. It's for the memes, if anything. But, I think my biggest surprise was Prince William's response, saying that that the royals are not racist.
I mean, what else is he going to say, I guess? I mean, you know what? We watched the interview, and I'll be honest, we're all very racist. So, yeah, he seemed to be at pay. I mean, I don't know what their schedule is like, but the fact that he showed up at some school where the teacher happened to be black today, maybe it was pre-planned. I don't know, but it seemed a little heavy-handed.
But, who are they fooling? What's not racist about this? Look at it, Eugene. You're not looking at it.
I saw it out of the corner of my eye. I mean, I have to say...
look at this, Eugene.
It's just even the sunglasses,
this man
smile.
Is saying that he's not a racist. This man.
Wow. Yeah. I mean...
Look at this image. How unsettling is
Prince
this?
Charles. Woo.
Eugene, why is this image so unsettling?
It's very unsettling.
I feel like out of all the images, this is the most unsettling one.
Why is that, Juan? Why is this the most unsettling?
It's the suit. It's the suit.
It is a little jarring.
No one wears that light of color unless they're flexing and they're not going to do any of the work.
It is indeed a summer suit. There's no doubt about that. He is on the veranda.
Look at this,
sipping
Eugene.
some cool lemonade.
Oh, that's different. This is something else. I don't know how that got there.
You know, that's a very good illusion. You know, in all seriousness, those photos, by the way, are from Tuvalu of the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge. And Tuvalu, of course, was a colony of the United Kingdom until 1974. The head of state is still the Queen. It seems like the more things change, perhaps the more they stay the same.
It's super strange too, because you know I'm sure when these images came out, there was outrage, and no matter like what folks say, like if you show up to the place and they're saying like, oh, we want to do this for you, you should be like, no, let me, I can walk. Right?
I'm sure they would say it would be some great snub or something like that if they didn't do it. But yeah, I'm with you, Juan. It speaks very much to the nature of the institution, that's for sure.
Yeah, but you know, I feel like with all these arguments, nobody wins with the family feuds, except for us, because then we get to laugh.
Yes. I mean, nobody wins, but no one really loses on their side. I mean, you've got Harry and Meghan, $143 million deal with Spotify. I don't actually keep up with how much money is given to the Royal House every year, but it's quite a bit. So in a way, nobody wins, nobody loses. I guess the people who do the best have to be the tabloids. It's a great, great week to have been any sort of tabloid publication, I'm sure.
Yeah, and they're everywhere. They're like doing late night shows. They've been doing it for like even a week in advance. So
supermarket checkout aisles are popping right now, I'm sure. That and the soap opera digests. No disrespect to soap opera digest. Well, Juan, I appreciate that. You know, look, we always try to start with a little levity when we start the show because so much of what we talk about is so serious and so important, and we want to cover that, but you have to also appreciate the funny things in life. Laugh to keep from crying, as they say. But we're going to move on with the show here just real quick. If you get a chance, just before we jump into it, please, if you can, share this stream, share it right now so that everyone who is following you can follow us. We've got some fantastic guests, important stories coming up. And also don't forget, you can go to patreon.com/breakthroughnews and support us. But as I mentioned at the outset of the show, this was more or less the beginning of the Derek Chauvin trial for his murder of George Floyd last year. It's taking place in Minneapolis. Of course, jury selection was this week. Oral arguments will begin on March 29th. But unfortunately, deeply, deeply unfortunately, George Floyd, even though for many of us he was maybe the first victim of police terror in the Minneapolis area that many people had heard of, some had heard of Philando Castile, but both of those individuals just a few entries in what has been a long, sordid history from the Minneapolis police, the St. Paul police, really the entire region. So we are very honored as we continue the show to really try to lift the veil on some of these stories that many of you around the country have undoubtedly never heard, but that are just as important and just as heart-wrenching as what we saw on video with George Floyd and what we know about that case. So as we move on here, we are very honored to be joined by three people. We have Toshira Garraway, who's the founder of Families Supporting Families Against Police Violence. Her fiance, Justin Teigen, was a victim of police murder. We have Amity DeMock, who's the mother of Kobe DeMock Heisler, who's a 21-year-old killed by the police in the Minneapolis area last year. And also, we're very happy to be joined by Matilda Smith, the mother of DeFort Smith, who was murdered also by St. Paul police in Minnesota. Toshira, Amity, and Matilda, thank you so much for being with us here on the Freedom Side.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you so much.
I have to say, the pleasure is all ours. I appreciate you all coming on so much. I think that it's so important in the context of, I think, everything we've seen with the eyes being turned, of the world being turned on Minneapolis, to hear, many of these stories. Ms. Garrow, I want to start with you here. As I just mentioned, the eyes of the world are on Minneapolis again because of this trial. George Floyd was just one of a long line of those who were murdered by police in the Minneapolis area. You lost your fiance, Justin, to police murder. If you could, please tell us what happened. Oh, you might be frozen.
Looking up to Cheryl.
All right, we're gonna see if we can get you back together
I'm
here
on
to
two
share.
cameras.
Perfect. Okay. Well,
I'm
we're
on
working
two
on that behind
cameras.
the scenes, but very important stuff. Miss Smith, I heard you sneak in there when we were talking. I know your son Jafar, when he was killed by St. Paul police, he was shot at least 49 times. Amazing to hear.
Jaffrey.
Just tell us what happened.
Jaffrey Smith, May 9th, 2016, was shot up 49 to 52 times and then shot with a shotgun. Um, uh, May 9th, 2016. Um, they left him back there with his pants down, pulled all the way down to his foot. And BCA come and notified me the next day. I had been looking for my son the first day though, because my son come eat breakfast with me every morning. I knew something was wrong. So I got on a phone, called his sister and brother and see what did they know anything about where he was. They didn't. Every time I hear that somebody got shot, I watch the news. So I heard that somebody had got shot that night before and that they had got shot a lot of times by the police. And it worried me because my son didn't come to eat breakfast with me that morning. So I called everybody, that we know, and they kept saying, "Stop worrying, Mama. He's okay." I had a nightmare about Jafford dying 2 months ago. Before he died, I had a nightmare about it. So I was just crazy on him. I think that was the worst few moments of his life because I tried to stop him from going anywhere when I had that nightmare. And his sister and brother thought I was just too hard on him. Get up off him. Why are you doing him like that? I had that nightmare and I woke up crying. Okay. When they came, BCA tried to beat my door down. I'm talking about it wasn't no knock, it was a beat. And it scared me to death. I asked them not to ever come back to my house again. They come in and told me that Matilda Smith, your son, Jaffer Smith, was killed last night. He got shot a lot of times. He got a lot of bullets in him. I had a smirk on that face. I'm going to tell you something. When I heard that, I was standing by my refrigerator. When he told me that, I couldn't feel my legs. So I went down to the floor, and they had to pick me up, both police. They kept telling me what they had done to my son. I was really, really, I think I lost it for a minute. I just blanked out, I believe. But then I said, Jafford has a wife. Why didn't you go to her? First, he's got a wife. I said, Jafford had children. I said, I don't know. I didn't know, what had happened and why. I was just listening to what they were saying. Only thing I could think of is I hope my son didn't shoot this woman. They say he shot a woman. And I hope that he didn't shoot her. So all this time, I've been thinking, I'd never believed that he shot anyone because that's not the type of person he was. But they kept demonizing my son, saying that he shot this girl, and they lied on him like he was a sex offender, and they just kept demonizing him in the papers. So that really took a lot out of me. That did a lot to me. All right, his wife, they messed with us so bad. They harassed us, me and his wife, because we got out and we started protesting. And we went to the Capitol and we went to the governor's mansion. We went everywhere. We was all out there on the highways. You know, it got where they started harassing my daughter-in-law. They would go in front of her house and turn that big spotlight on in the car and shine it straight through her house. Just sit out there. She went through so much with them. And they come and bust her office door down and broke in her office where her business was and took her to jail, locked her up. Because she called the chief and asked him, why did they she called for the chief. They would never put the chief on. So she talked to the dispatcher, and she said, "I want to know, talk to the chief." He never came to me and apologized. He never came to me and tell me why they killed my husband. They started messing with Kay, and Kay was in and out of court. They gave her a record, and she had an ankle bracelet on. She went through courts for a whole year, and they convicted Kay.
Wow.
So they had Kay wearing an ankle bracelet on. She was like on papers for like 2 or 3 more years. So what they did was ruin her life. Kay had license in closing. She lost her license. Kay had to sell her house. These people ruined Kay so bad that Kay wanted to die. She tell me every day I stopped her from committing suicide about 100 times. One night I called Kay and asked her how she was doing. And Kay said, "I'm all right." That was the night before Kay died was the happiest night of her life. And I don't know why. I think Kay knew she was going. She always wanted to die. So that night I talked to her. And the next day I got a call from the police. Kay was dead. Kay, just as
Wow.
quick as I took my eyes off of her, she committed suicide.
Wow.
She
Please.
she just couldn't do it. She just couldn't do it anymore. She tried everything, to come back to herself. She just never could after she saw those records. She saw his record and she saw that they had wronged him. She saw that they had lied on him, and she saw that he never shot this girl at all. And it almost killed Kay. It did kill her. It killed her. 2 days before Christmas last year, Kay died.
Wow.
There were many
Ms.
ripple
Smith,
effects.
thank you so much for sharing that. And I think it's so important to, just all those who really lose so much in these police murders. Mr. Mock, I know you also lost your son, Kobe. Please, if you could, just tell us some of that story of what took place there.
Hi, yeah. My son was 21 years old. He was the most beautiful person I knew in the world, next to my daughter. And he was on the autism spectrum. That day, he had gotten upset over a messed up order at a fast food restaurant and got into an argument with his grandfather. Grandfather left him at the restaurant, which was only like 6 blocks away. Son came home, was threatening to hurt himself. The grandfather called 911. As soon as that happened, my son calmed down. So the grandfather called 911 back, said, Kobe's fine. We don't need you guys to come. They chose to come anyhow. Ran up to the house, all crazy like. The grandfather saw him through the window, greeted them at the door, came out and spoke to them, told them everything was fine. My son was fine. The officers wanted to go in. Grandfather said again, really, you don't need to go in there. Everything's fine. If you go in there, you'll probably make a situation worse that's already under control. Two of the officers chose to go in there. They searched him, set him in the middle of the room. I had about 12 minutes of conversation with him where he was, complying the whole time. At one point, you see him just put his face down into his hands and start crying. And then within the next second, you see him just get up. And as far as I'm aware, he was going to run through the room to get out the back door. The police, who are already familiar with his house because they responded to him stabbing himself in the stomach about 2 months prior. So, mind you, they know he hurts himself, not other people. All that you know is all of a sudden you hear commotion, and within seconds they simultaneously tase and shoot multiple shots at him, shooting him dead in front of his grandmother in his own home on a reverse 911 call simply because my son was having a bad day. And as I said, the police officers knew who he was and knew what his situation was. When I see some of the commentary when the story first came up, well, did they know he was autistic? And did he know? Yeah, they knew he was, and they knew he was not a threat to other people. But for some reason, watch the unedited version of the tapes, which they don't show you. One of the police officers says that my son was going to, the next time they got called to that home, it would be because my son had killed either the grandfather or the grandmother. And literally within a minute, that same officer went in and shot my son.
Wow.
And then, just to let you know, they also put handcuffs on somebody who's dead, and then accost the grandmother after they yell expletives, F, 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 get her out of the house, get her out of the house. And then physically try to move this woman who is physically incapable of doing that out of the house. It was just a ridiculous mess. But the most important thing is they came in on a call that was a reverse 911 call. Everything was already fine. And as far as I'm concerned, they are 100% responsible for my son's murder and will pay somehow.
Mm-hmm. Well, I agree with you, 100% responsible for sure. Ms. Garraway, thank you for sticking with us here. And I was hoping you could just tell us, you lost your fiance, Justin, I know, to police violence, and I was hoping you could tell us that story.
Yes, the father of my now 14-year-old son, Justin Tigan Jr., was brutally beat to death by the St. Paul police and thrown inside of a trash dumpster August 19th, 2009. They the St. Paul police showed up at Justin's grandmother's home. They never told us that he was pulled over. They told us that he was in an accident and that he was missing from the scene of an accident. We found out later that he was in fact pulled over. Um, they also gave us the wrong address of where this event happened. So with the inconsistencies, we then walked into the mortuary, and Justin's skull was cracked in half. He had dog bites on his body. His wrist was detached from his arms. His head was the size of a basketball. It was clear that a beating took place. It was literally a 2009 Emmett Till, and it was the most horrific thing I've ever seen. Um, and after that, we started seeking answers. So we reached out to the forensic pathologist. At that point, she showed us a video that the St. Paul police would never allow our family to watch for some reason. But when we seen the video, we seen the police catch Justin in the video, and the video goes blank. So it is clear that the video was tampered with and edited, and that is when the harassment started. That is when, because we were seeking answers, that's when they started sitting outside my home, sitting outside of Justin's home, following me with my child in the car, following Justin's mother with, with her other children. They would wave at me when they seen me, just to let me know I know who you are. So that's why I always tell people, prior to George Floyd, there has been hundreds, literally hundreds of murders here in the state of Minnesota. And the only difference between George Floyd's case and the rest of our cases is that it was caught on Facebook Live, it spread too fast, and they were not able to edit the video. They were not able to catch the video in time like they did the rest of our stories. That is the only difference. But it is hundreds, 470 murders at the hands of law enforcement of Black and Indigenous people in the last 21 years, since the year 2000, and only one officer has been convicted of killing a civilian, and that is the minority man that killed a white woman here in the state of Minnesota's history. So these are literally hate crimes that are going on here in Minnesota. There's been many, many more murders prior to George Floyd. The families here are scared. They're afraid to come forward. I was afraid for many years. And I'm finally just fighting through the fear.
The thing I have to say I find myself just sitting with hearing all these stories is the tremendous amount of just absolute disrespect that was shown to you all and to your families after, the worst thing that can happen to any of us, that we lose a loved one. Just, I mean, I almost don't even know what to say. I mean, it's so absurd, the level where that is. Ms. Garraway, I'll ask you a follow-up question, and then I sort of want everyone's thoughts about this. You're the co-founder of Families Supporting Families Against Police Violence. How important, or why was it so important for you to come together with other families and present a united front in these cases?
It was important because when we lose our loved ones, it's a different situation if you lose your loved one by a regular civilian on the street. They have absolutely no support here for the families here in Minnesota after they murder our loved ones in cold blood. The people in the political seats, the people that have a chance, the mayors, have a chance to make a change, they have not reached out to our families. They have not, they've allowed this. They've allowed this to happen to our families here in the state of Minnesota. There is no surprise that Minnesota is on. The world is watching Minnesota right now because this place is treacherous, and it's like Jim Crow of the North. It is a treacherous place here in Minnesota, and the reason that we needed to come together is because there's something called the Crime Victims Justice Unit. That is a reparation board here in the state of Minnesota that helps people if they lose a loved one in a violent manner. A regular civilian kills your loved one in a violent manner. They help to pay for funeral costs. They help to pay for mental health services. And if the person had children, like I did with Justin, they will help pay for $400 a month until the child is 18. But if your loved one is killed by a civilian, it is assumed that your loved one deserved whatever treatment they receive. And as we see with George Floyd, that simply wasn't the case. But it is assumed that your loved one is not a victim. So we don't qualify for those services. So, like Amity, who we have on tonight, she has her denial letter. And there's other families that have denial letters. Although we lost our loved ones violently, we don't qualify, and we're left out here. These families are left to just try to pay for funerals, try to pay for mental health services for their families. If they have children, they're scraping up money for that. I know families that have gone homeless because they killed the other half to the home, the other half to the children. So this is really going on. This is real in Minnesota. To everybody, to every human being that was stolen, there's co-workers, brothers and sisters, significant others, neighbors. There's so many people that's attached to that person. You multiply that times 470. Um, and that's over 1 million people in the state of Minnesota alone that's been impacted by police murders. You heard Matilda Smith talk about how the wife was affected, and how they just traumatize our families after they murder our loved ones. So George Floyd is just the face of hundreds of murders here in the state of Minnesota. And it's not just the police. It is the BCA, the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension, the forensic pathologists, the county attorneys. They have a whole system working together to cover up many murders prior to George Floyd. And we were pleading with this state, with the people in the political seats prior to George Floyd to make changes, and they refused to do so. And that is why George Floyd is not alive today. And it is important for our families to be together to share that pain because we don't have anywhere else to turn. We have to turn to each other. And that's why we have our support group where we've been sticking together and fighting together. I'm afraid for my life. I'm living here in Minnesota afraid for my life because I'm coming forward with my story and being and coming alongside of Philando Castile's mom, the rest of these Jamar Clark's family, and the rest of these families to be a support system because we're all that each other has. There's no way that a man was killed, Philando Castile, prior to Justine Damon, a white woman. That officer walked free, and he's the only officer in history out of all of these bodies to be convicted. It's what's going on. It's racially motivated murders, white privilege, and we have to call it out for what it is. It's the truth. And George Floyd was just one of that. And they were not able to catch the video in time. If they were able to, video with just like the rest of ours.
Mr. Mock, and certainly please feel free to comment on anything that Ms. Garraway said, but I mean, I'm also, one thing that I think is crucial is you mentioned your son was on the autism spectrum, and it seems that in addition to everything else we can say about police murders, his case is one of the many that really shows us the just, I don't even really know what to call it, the just ridiculousness of how the police address someone in a mental health crisis.
Yeah, and the greatest population, the population that is at the greatest risk for police violence across the board is people with mental health disabilities of all colors. So I like to say here in Minnesota, we have a problem with police attacking people because of the color of their skin. We have a problem with police attacking people because they don't know how to deal with their mental illness. So here in Minnesota, we just have a police violence problem. Like I say, 54% of these violent encounters are with people on the mental health spectrum, or on the mental health or autism spectrum. We have been able to do things like last year, the families and our allies were able to get a special session for some of the police reform bills, and we were able to get the autism training bills for police officers passed, and mental health training for police officers. Important distinction because they're different, and other things like chokeholds and everything. Now, the strange thing is I don't actually agree with that at all. I participated in it because it seemed better than nothing, as long as the officers are still going to be responding to these calls. Try to get them the training, but what I actually support is the police officers not being responders. I think that mental health responders would be more appropriate for a mental health situation. I haven't had time to read the article, but I know that Colorado just did that for 6 months and posted their results, which were, from what I read, nothing but positive. So also when people say, they get all afraid of that word, defund the police, oh, grow up, First off, find a dictionary. We're not talking about taking them away. We're talking about putting the more appropriate responders in those situations. Police are good to respond to a violent situation. That was not a violent situation. That was a mental health situation. So it's really important to me, and that's kind of like my focus, is to make sure that people that have mental health issues or autism are protected, and that these people who are interacting, until we can change who that is, are better equipped to do that, because autism is not a crime and mental health is not a crime. But currently our people all around the nation are dying as a result of their conditions, and my big concern is that the prevalence of people with mental health issues or people with autism diagnoses are just increasing very quickly. So this is a problem that's not only not going to go away, it's going to become more of an issue if we don't deal with it right now.
Mm-hmm. Well, just one more time before we close, I just want to say Justin Teigen, Kobe DeMar Keisler, JaFort Smith, all murdered by police in the Minneapolis area. And we were honored to be joined here by their families. Please get on Facebook, get on your social media, go to Families Supporting Families Against Police Violence. Get behind these families. Let's lift up these cases. It's good we know about George Floyd. We need to know about everyone else. But Toshira Garraway, Amita Demock, Matilda Smith, so honored. Thank you so much for joining us here on the Freedom Side.
Thank you
so
for
much for
having
having us.
Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm. Pleasure was all ours.
Whose streets are Whose streets Whose streets Whose streets say his name. And when I wake up, say his name. 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 What do we want? When do we want it? What do we want?
Those were protests in Minneapolis as the Chauvin trial opened this week, as it were. People continuing to mobilize very strongly there in the Minneapolis area around the case of George Floyd, demanding justice for George Floyd. And as we continue the show, we are very happy to be joined here by Nekima Levy Armstrong, who's the founder of the Racial Justice Network, an activist and civil rights attorney, and also Michelle Gross, who is the president of Communities Against Police Brutality, a longtime anti-police brutality organizer. Nekima, Michelle, thank you so much for being with us here on the Freedom Side.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you
Well,
for
the
having
pleasure
me.
is all ours. Nekima, I'll start with you here. Well, here we are. I think the eyes of the world again are on Minneapolis, and people are looking at this trial. I think for many people, our hopes are not up as to what the outcome of this trial will be, given that we've seen so many of these go the wrong way, unfortunately. So I guess my first question for you here is, what are you expecting in this trial, and are you expecting anything that comes out of it to even approximate justice for George Floyd?
Well, unfortunately, I'm expecting a lot of shenanigans and misusing of the legal system to try to justify the murder of George Floyd at the hands of 4 Minneapolis police officers. We know that this first trial is focused on Derek Chauvin. Some people think that it is a slam dunk simply because we saw a bystander video that was extremely compelling. However, history has shown us that even with video evidence of an officer engaging in violent and abusive and deadly conduct, it does not always equate to a conviction, and most of the time it doesn't. And if Derek Chauvin is acquitted, we foresee that there will not even be a trial for the other 3 officers who were involved in killing George Floyd.
You know, I wonder, and just to ask you a quick follow-up on that question, I mean, what are some of these shenanigans that you are expecting here? I mean, I think some of us, we see a lot of these trials, but for those who maybe haven't, what should they be looking for that is, you know, a sleight of hand or a misdirection play?
Well, one of the things that we have been concerned about early on was a jury questionnaire that was sent out. I believe it was about 16 pages long. And the jury questionnaire asked prospective jurors whether or not they supported the Black Lives Matter movement, how they felt about it, as well as the defund the police movement. There was also a focus on Blue Lives Matter as well. And a part of the concern was whether or not they would use questions pertaining to Black Lives Matter and the defund the police movement as a way of excluding potential jurors who might have some empathy in their hearts and who might actually be concerned about justice.
You know, Michelle, similar question in a way. I mean, we're just roughly a couple months from almost a year on the murder of George Floyd. We're here at this trial. I think for a lot of people who are outside of Minneapolis, you know, you only sort of see, you saw what happened to George Floyd, you saw the protests, and now people are coming back around. You know, almost a year later, where are we? Have we seen progress in the city of Minneapolis on some of these broader issues?
You know, sadly, we haven't. Our city council has been utterly moribund in terms of not making any changes whatsoever. You know, Nekima and I work closely together along with other activists, so we have a whole coalition working to try to get the city to make changes, as well as to advance bills in the legislature. And, you know, even though we're the epicenter of protest, you know, we jumped off an international movement, the likes of which has never been seen in the world. We still in Minneapolis and still in the state of Minnesota have made almost no changes. It is truly shameful. You know, and I want to speak a little bit to the question that you asked Nekima about what will happen if Derek Chauvin walks. And I'm fearful of it. I think they're going to put, you know, George Floyd on trial. I think Derek Chauvin's going to talk about, well, this was my training. You know, they let me do this, because he had done this exact conduct to 7 other people at least prior to him killing George Floyd. And the city never stopped him. You know, he's had just 26 complaints. Almost none have resulted in any discipline, you know, a tiny little, you know, reprimand or whatever. And he's been involved in the deaths of 5 people. And he has had no consequences for any of this conduct. So if they let this guy walk, what I fear more than anything is how it will unleash the police. It will unleash police violence on our community, the likes of which we have never seen before, because they will truly feel that they have impunity for anything they do. And I'm very, very worried about that.
Well, I'm glad you raised that too, Michelle, because it does seem to me, just looking at even the preparations, is almost if they're preparing for him to be let off. I mean, I'm seeing these photos of them setting up like a green zone, and obviously it's not the people who are out in the streets protesting. So, I mean, it almost feels like they are assuming that he's going to get off and already maybe like pre-preparing for what comes after that, or what they think will come after that, what they want people to think.
Exactly. I mean, we have like literally almost like, I call it the Berlin Wall around our government center. And our government center is a courthouse, but it's also a lot of other things. It provides a lot of other kinds of services. There's social services that are normally accessed through that building, and, you know, all kinds of services for domestic abuse and all kinds of other services. No one can use that building because they've dedicated that entire building to the trial of one murderer. You know, there's no other situation that I've seen the whole time I've lived here, 30 years, where they've given a building over to one guy for one murder trial. This never happens. You know, we have murder trials here all the time. This kind of thing never happens. But instead, they built this, what I literally call the Berlin Wall, around this building and around our city hall as well. And, you know, a lot of people think it's because that they're going to let this guy off. And I frankly am fearful that they will. You know, I have a lot of fear about that because, again, what I see would happen with the police and what that would unleash on the community is almost unfathomable. It really is. And so, yeah, this is it's a terrible situation.
You know, that sense of impunity, I think people feel I mean, I can certainly understand. I think we feel it in so many places, but it reminds me of something I've been reflecting on, quite a bit since I was in Minneapolis last year. And, you know, one of the things that I remember, it really stuck with me, and several people, more than several people, told me something similar, but I was talking to a young black man, and, you know, just about the situation. And he said to me, he said, see, he asked me where I was from, and I told him I was from New York, and he said, see, now y'all see. You see what's happening to us. You see what's going on out here, that it's real out here. And I was hoping you could speak to that a little bit, Nekima, because really, ever since that's happened, I think about it like once a week, because just that feeling that seems so palpable amongst so many people, that pain, that so many things had happened for so many years, but outside of the Minneapolis area, people didn't know. People felt it's happening here, but no one knows. And I was hoping, I know it's a general thing I'm saying here, Nekima, but it was a powerful sentiment to hear from people all over the area. And it really has stuck with me since then.
Well, I think a lot of people have been surprised to know that Black people actually live in Minnesota. Right. It's not one of the places you typically think about as being an oasis for Black folks, although that's the dream that our PR officials, known as our government, is trying to sell to the masses. But the reality is that Black people who live here, especially those who don't work in corporate America, have had it very hard for a very long time. I moved here in 2003, and within a few years, as I looked at the racial disparities across every key indicator of quality of life, I realized this is the Jim Crow North. And I started to say that about Minnesota, and people would be surprised because they were under the illusion that we are a progressive state. But when you look at education, look at health disparities, home ownership rates, employment rates and unemployment rates and income, every key indicator of quality of life, Black people are far below their white counterparts in terms of access to opportunity. And then when you look at policing and how often Black people are pulled over and racially profiled and criminalized, we exceed what is happening to Black people in other parts of the country. So it's been problematic for a long time. For some reason, it was below the radar screen. But many of us, like Michelle said, we just made a decision that we weren't going to tolerate this anymore. So we started taking to the streets, and we've been marching for at least the last 6 years straight. Whether the world is watching or not, we're out in the streets, we're shutting shit down, we're demanding justice, and we've built momentum. And so when this horrific crime happened to George Floyd, we were able to mobilize very quickly because we have been consistent over the years.
I think that's so critically important. I just asked you a quick follow-up about that, Nekima, and then I also want your thoughts on a similar question, Michelle. But talk a little bit about the importance of that kind of consistent organizing. I mean, I think that so many times these cases just pop up and people hear the name, they see a few things, but that sort of subterranean fire, if you will, is so critical.
Absolutely. I feel that we have one of the most engaged and organized communities in the country. And it's Black people, it's white people, it's Latinos, it's Native people, it's Hmong people out on the front lines demanding justice. And so not only do we take it to the streets, we take it to the halls of power. We even have people who have run for office, and some have won their seats in order to become decision makers. So that type of consistency is vitally important, so that you're not just ebbing and flowing with what the media is focused on, but you're focused on achieving justice and actually transforming systems that are producing racism and equity and perpetuating white supremacy.
Michelle, same question, if you could speak to that.
I think that that's really an important question. You know, part of the value of us all working together is that we had an infrastructure in place so that when George Floyd was killed, that night, we were able to put up the records of those cops. You know, I actually recognized Derek Chauvin on the video, and I heard a man in the video yelling out his badge number. So I pulled out my badge number list, looked at it, said, yes, that is Derek Chauvin, and we were able to put up his record that night so that the community knew who this person was and what his horrible record was. You know what I mean? And the same with Tutao, the other cop that you could see on the video. And so, and then we immediately were able to get people in the street. We were immediately able to put forward a list of recommendations for ending police violence. You know, we basically had that infrastructure in place. And so people, it's important that we do these things, you know, not just to address these really egregious incidents like, you know, these killings, but also to address the day-to-day police brutality that creates the climate that allows these kinds of incidents to occur. And then when you have that infrastructure in place, it allows you to step up when you need to really, you know, mobilize the community to do powerful things. And you know, so I just think that that's key, is not just to wait till something bad happens and organize, but to have things going on all the time so that people are ready, you know, at all moments to address what we need to address. To me, that's really key.
Just to Michelle's point about us already being mobilized, part of that has to do as well with some of the relationships that we have with people in positions of authority. So it's a relationship where we're able to call them up, challenge them, demand justice, and ask questions. And so on the night that George Floyd was killed, before anyone knew about it, a family member of a victim of police murder, a woman named Ashley Quinones, actually found out about it through people in the community, and she put a post up on Facebook, and she tagged me and several other people and said that Minneapolis police killed a man. They either crushed his throat or they did something connected to his throat that caused him to die. And so I looked online and I didn't see anything. And so at that point, I reached out to the chief and I said, did Minneapolis police kill someone? And he said, no, it was a medical issue. That's what his officers had told him, that it was someone who suffered a medical issue and died in custody. And I said, that's not what the community's saying. Have you looked at video? He said, no. We sent it to the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension to investigate, just standard procedure. He had no idea of the magnitude of this situation, or that his officers had intentionally knelt on the neck of George Floyd and killed him. And so at that point, I went back on Facebook and Ashley had tagged me in a bystander video. And then I called the chief and said, your officers did this. This wasn't a medical issue. They caused a medical issue. And the chief had literally just seen the video. And then from that point, we demanded that those cops be fired. Like Michelle said, we had the infrastructure. So we worked through the night. We put the Facebook event page up, attended meetings at City Hall, And, the rest is history, literally. But it's because we're never resting when we get small victories. We're relentless in the pursuit of justice.
Two things really stick out to me, but about everything you all said, which was all on point. The PR of what Minneapolis is like for Black people, and thinking George Floyd coming there from Houston to improve his life, and the idea of the everyday police brutality and racism, even the fact that a alleged $20 counterfeit bill allegedly led to something like this. It just, I don't have a question there. It just is
the crazy part, I'm sorry, the crazy part
Michelle,
is that
please go ahead.
Having a counterfeit $20 bill in Minnesota is not even a crime. It's not even a crime. And so one of the things that people have to understand is that when the two rookie officers approached Derek Chauvin with guns drawn in his face, he had not actually committed a crime. And so for them to start off the encounter that way, in other words, everybody's like, oh, Derek Chauvin, he did his thing. And then, these guys, they're just kind of bystanders. No, they weren't bystanders. They approached George Floyd with guns in his face. They took him out of his car. They handcuffed him. They seized him. They made an arrest without probable cause. All of these things are what generated this thing. And then, they shove him into a squad car. Derek Chauvin shows up, takes him out of the squad car with no reason. Again, none of this force was valid or legitimate because he had not even committed a crime. And so that's where things start, and they go downhill from there. So I think people really need to know that. And, by us knowing these things and having that infrastructure, we're able to talk about these things intelligently. And it was interesting what Nekima said, because I'll never forget, I watched the video, I saw what happened, and a few minutes later, the police information officer, John Elder, stood out on the sidewalk with media and said, we had an encounter with a man tonight and he died from a medical emergency. And I remember thinking to myself, died from a medical emergency? That was a murder. No ifs, ands, or buts.
Final question for both of you. Michelle, I'll start with you. What do we need to see happen to prevent situations like George Floyd and so many of these other police murders we see on a sadly regular basis?
There are lots of things that need to happen. But what we really have to start with is accountability for the police. And part of the accountability is not to wait till they kill somebody. When somebody's brutalizing people, when they're putting phony charges on people, when they're doing all of this other bad conduct, we need to see some real discipline. Let's take care of this problem before we get to the point of them murdering somebody. A guy like, Derek Chauvin had 26 incidents. He had kneeled on the neck of 7 people before he did this to the 8th person, George Floyd. He had killed 5 people before he killed George Floyd. So the idea that this guy could do all this with no repercussions whatsoever, that's what led him to be on a video smiling as he crushes the life out of this man. And had no problem with the fact that people were videotaping him doing that. He thought, I'm going to get away with this because I got away with it every other time. And that's what leads to that mentality.
I agree with what Michelle just said. A lot of this has to do with shifting the culture within not only Minneapolis police, but police departments around the country, and rethinking the role of police. We have police over-policing our communities. Why is it a jobs program for white men that sets them and their families up for generational success? Why do they have so much unchecked authority? Why do they have militarized weapons? Why are they able to be the front line of access towards the criminal justice system, which we know has positioned us in this country of having the highest rate of incarceration in the world? None of that is by accident. All of it is by design, and it needs to dramatically shift. Police only need to be reserved for the most serious offenses that perhaps the average person can't handle on their own. But the stuff that people call 911 for, police should not be the people showing up at the door. They shouldn't be pulling people over for, equipment violations, harassing people on the streets like they did in New York with stop and frisk. We need to completely dismantle and overhaul what we call the system of policing, as well as its evil sister, the system of mass incarceration, because the two go hand in hand.
Thank you both so much for joining us. Really appreciate you giving us some of your time. I know you have so much important work going on. Michelle Gross, Nekima Levy Armstrong, thanks once again for joining us here on the Freedom Side.
Thanks for having us.
Well, we're going to keep the movement moving on, as they say, as we continue the show here. We are very happy to be joined by Dr. Gerald Horne, who's the Moores Professor of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston, the author of many, many texts, including The Fire This Time, The Watts Uprising, and the 1960s. Dr. Horne, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for inviting me.
Well, the pleasure is all ours. You've probably heard some of our conversation here. We've been talking all day about police murder, police terrorism, police brutality. I guess my first question for you here is, how is it possible that a problem like this could be so endemic? It feels like every decade we go back and there are, these sorts of cases like George Floyd, where the name is just synonymous with police brutality year after year, decade after decade. How can this be so in a democracy, Dr. Horne?
Well, it's not only so in a so-called democracy, it's certainly so in the Twin Cities. You may recall the similar case of Philando Castile a few years ago in the Twin Cities, a licensed gun holder who was captured on tape telling an officer that he has a gun in his glove compartment, and the officer then proceeds to kill him on the spot. And of course, the officer does not serve time. This is a reminder that we would be remiss, we would be negligent if we failed to acknowledge that the United States was a country that has been built upon the enslavement of Black people and on the degradation of Black life. And what is happening today is just a continuation of refusing to grasp that nettle and instead comforting ourselves with fantasies about how it's an incomplete democracy or an imperfect democracy, when actually we should be talking about the United States as the first apartheid regime, insofar as when the vaunted Constitution was proclaimed in the late 18th century, it did not apply to Black people, it did not apply to indigenous people, and it's been an uphill climb since the 18th century to force this government to apply basic democratic rights and liberties to those who were originally and initially excluded. And the George Floyd murder trial tends to suggest that that struggle has yet to be won.
It's an interesting question about how that struggle is waged, or how it should be or could be waged. And certainly your own work, your own body of work has, I think, very ably shown that throughout history, African people here in the United States have frequently, lengthened the battlefield, if you will. They've looked to exploit contradictions in the international sphere. At least it seems that there is at least an implicit reality here that it's very difficult for there to be, quote unquote, at least, Black progress in America outside of, this sort of context of the ability or sort of perhaps the inability of the United States to escape the specter of their own contradictions.
Well, yes, and I think the missing link right now with regard to waging a successful and victorious struggle on the Black Liberation Front has been the ability to wage a globalized struggle. Now, to a degree that's taking place, we know that as we speak, the Human Rights Council of the United Nations in Geneva, Switzerland, has been investigating various cases of police terror, focusing particularly on the Michael Brown case from 2014 in Ferguson, Missouri, not least because the family of Michael Brown has prosecuted that case globally at Geneva. But we need much more on that front. I think it's unfortunate that many of our organizations do not regularly attend meetings of the Caribbean community in Georgetown, Guyana, or the African Union in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. or even set up an outpost at the European Union in Brussels, Belgium, not to mention trying to reach out to allies in Havana and Beijing in particular. We know that historically, the way we were able to escape slavery was through international solidarity, not least, particularly with the Haitian Revolution, 1791 to 1804. And we also know that one of the ways we were able to escape the ravages of Jim Crow was because of the existence of a socialist camp, which then put pressure from above on the United States while we were pressing from below. We're still pressing from below. We don't necessarily have the pressure from above, and that is the missing link with regard to our struggle as we speak.
I think that's such an important point. I was reading an article earlier this week in the Wall Street Journal, for whatever reason, and it was on this sort of a similar note. The author was critiquing the Chinese Communist Party for raising the issue of the United States being white supremacist, and was noting that more and more of the Chinese government spokespeople in the international stage were raising this directly when they were being asked, well, what about XYZ criticism of you from the United States? They were putting it in the context of white supremacy, racism, the image of China historically in the West, and all of these different things. And of course, the Wall Street Journal is saying, oh, what a terrible thing, and how terrible it is. But to me, it seemed quite significant because it does seem it's been some time since any sort of major nation, I should say, has really raised this level of critique against the United States.
Well, you are correct. I saw that piece in the Wall Street Journal as well. And I was struck by the fact that it was appearing just a day or two before the U.S. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken and the National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan meet with their Chinese counterparts in Alaska. And we all know that at this meeting in Alaska, the United States will be pressing China on the question of the Uyghurs, on the question of Tibet, on the question of Hong Kong and Muslim minorities in China. And as I was reading that article in the Wall Street Journal that you referenced, I was wondering, well, are the Chinese going to come back and ask about the George Floyd case? Are they going to ask about police terror against Black citizens in the United States of America and the long and dastardly history of our mistreatment and maltreatment? It seems to me that China would be missing the boat if they fail to counter these allegations put forward by their U.S. counterparts by bringing out of their briefcase chapter and verse with regard to how we have been so atrociously maltreated in this country. But we shall see. I'm eagerly awaiting the press reports about this Alaska summit.
You know, one of the things that I think about in this regard as well, of course, because what sort of that Wall Street Journal post is indicative of what is thrown at Black America, right? If you embrace any international connection, you're somehow subversive, you're somehow terrible, you're somehow this, or that this country is worse than the United States, this or that country is worse than the United States, so you have it sort of better here. A lot of subjectivity and all of that, but I think it's an important question in terms of how people view this question, Dr. Horne, of their own positioning here in the United States and the legitimacy of appealing outside of the democratic framework in a way that can be effective, but that, well, let me just stop there. That can be effective, but I think is often maligned.
Well, what's remarkable about what you're saying is that in the recently published memoir of the 44th U.S. President Barack Obama, A Promised Land, he spends some time discussing what happened in August 2009 when his popularity ratings went through the basement after he sided with Harvard professor Henry Louis Gates after his confrontation with a Cambridge, Massachusetts police officer. Now, Mr. Obama, who is not necessarily known for being rather radical or perceptive when it comes to questions of white supremacy, went on at some length talking about how he recognized afterwards that he had touched a kind of third rail of U.S. domestic politics, that the question of how the police treat Black Americans is a question that's fraught historically. He could have gone on to say that it goes back to the slave patrols. He could have gone on to say how in some ways the entire white citizenry was deputized to patrol and help to arrest and detain runaway slaves. which gives them a kind of investment in the status quo because, of course, they could receive a bounty. They could receive a reward if they returned a runaway to the plantation or to his site or her site of work. And so we need further and deeper explorations along that line. And the shame in the United States is that the chief executive officer of U.S. imperialism, in that brief passage in his memoir, in some ways was more incisive than many of those in this country who consider themselves to be radical, who oftentimes tends to see these tragic cases of George Floyd and Eric Garner and Sandra Bland and all the rest as being sort of accidents, a malfunctioning of the system, as opposed to being a representative of how the system is functioning, how it was constructed historically, and how it will continue to function unless and until we can mobilize not only domestically, but internationally.
You know, thinking of Barack Obama and of course what you said earlier about the imperfect democracy concept, obviously, you know, in his first book and well, several other things, you know, he made that sort of a hallmark of his presidency. Like, yes, things have been bad, but look, I'm the president now. Haven't things must have improved. And, you know, even thinking about that has me thinking, you know, you've written about jazz, you've written about boxing and the political economy of racism, and both of those is as much as, and rightfully so in many ways, we celebrate Black first and, you know, the first Black president, the first this, the first that. The thing that's notable to me about both the boxing context and the jazz context is it seems like that's another sort of through line in U.S. history, at least maybe in the 20th century, is this construction of a form of Black success, you know, for individuals or for small groups, almost as a smokescreen for the reality of for the majority.
Well, it's interesting, the cases that you mentioned, because I think that one of the reasons you've had Black people disproportionately represented in sports is that oftentimes your success or failure in sports turns upon objective criteria. That is to say, you can either run 40 yards in 4.3 seconds or you can't. You can either jump straight up 5 feet in the air or you can't. Whereas with regard to other positions, for example, if you're going to be the manager of a boxer or the booker in a jazz club, it's oftentimes based on subjective criteria. It's oftentimes the criteria are quite slippery and quite imprecise. And in that area where you see imprecision and slipperiness, you begin to see how white supremacy rears its ugly head. And so even when we talk about these areas where Black Americans have been allowed to excel and have been able to knock down the walls that were keeping us back, we don't really get to the issue, which is how we're doing better in areas where there are objective criteria. In fact, this tunes in and also speaks to the question of why Asian American parents oftentimes encourage their children to go into math and science, because it's much more of objective criteria with regard to success or failure, as opposed to, for example, the humanities, for example, where oftentimes the criteria for success or failure is much more imprecise, thereby allowing, once again, white supremacy to raise its ugly head.
As you mentioned at the outset, white supremacy is the DNA of the United States. You said the first ever apartheid state. If that is the case in terms of the lineage, you know, what does that say about U.S. capitalism and racism and their relationship? Do the two must go together to transcend one? Do you have to transcend both?
Well, I think so. It's interesting. A new edition of the classic text, Capitalism of Slavery, written by the late Eric Williams, the founding father of Trinidad and Tobago, has just been reissued, and I'm rereading it for the umpteenth time. And he established 75 odd years ago the intimate connection between capitalism and slavery. You should not see it as accidental or a mere correlation that as capitalism is rising, the slave trade is rising. Because we know that one of the most profitable and lucrative enterprises known to humankind was the African slave trade. You could oftentimes invest $1 and get $1,700 back. There are those in Wall Street as we speak who would sell their firstborn for a 1,700% profit, let alone some African person they did not know. this provided the so-called primitive accumulation of capital that allows capitalism as a system to take off. This system was based and built upon the shoulders and backs of our ancestors. And when that takes place, it should not be deemed surprising or shocking that we are still treated as if we're an aspect of fungible capital, that our lives are meaningless, as almost as meaningless as they were during the times of slavery. And until we get to the essence of this question, until we take a radical point of view, which only means getting to the root of the question, which means getting to the root of capitalism by analyzing slavery, I'm afraid to say that we're always going to be, or at least some of us will be, shocked and surprised by these killings that take place on tape in places like Minneapolis, Minnesota.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, it is such a pleasure to talk to you. I appreciate you giving us some of your time here on this Thursday night. Thanks so much for joining us here on the Freedom Side.
Thank you for inviting me.
The pleasure was all ours. And that is going to bring us to the close of the Freedom Side on this Thursday night. We're going to be off next week, so we'll be off that Thursday night, but we will be back with you very soon. But I appreciate everybody for watching here tonight on the Freedom Side. And don't forget, you can go to patreon.com/breakthrough-news. Patreon.com/breakthrough-news, and you can become a patron. You can support us. We are brought to you by you. So all the support you give us helps us do shows like the Freedom Side, on the Picket Line, the Punch Out, everything that we do here, and we'll continue to do, and we'll continue to grow as we continue into 2021. So thanks again, everyone, for watching us here on the Freedom Side. Please, if you didn't hit the share button, it's too late now because we're ending the show, but take some time later today, later tomorrow, share the link to this show on YouTube or wherever else you can so people can see these crucially important stories, especially the families of police terrorism in the Minneapolis area. It's necessary to do. Thank you again. This was the Freedom Side here on Breakthrough News.